Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. We're going to devote the entirety of this show to the upcoming summit meeting on Friday between President Trump, Prime Minister Pashinyan, and the dictator from Baku. Obviously, our show is being taped prior to the meeting, so what we're going to try to do is to try to tell you what we think is likely to happen tomorrow when the meeting takes place, and more importantly, the road that brought us to this moment. So what is most likely to happen tomorrow? Likely two things. The first one is they're likely to either say that they will actually sign, publicly declare that they will sign the peace agreement in some other day, or they will actually ceremonially initial it without actually signing it. I know this sounds absurd. In diplomatic terms, it's sort of like being half pregnant. Then they are likely to announce that they've agreed to, on principle, to the Trump road via Syunik that's going to be controlled by the Americans without actually giving exact details. What this means in outcomes for all of these three leaders is three things. Trump gets another peace agreement that he can tout. He claims to be averaging one peace agreement a month, and he's campaigning for actually to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and this is not a joke, it's actually something that they're working on. The Prime Minister of Armenia gets to tout some kind of a success in his so far not very successful peace agenda, something that he can run on during next year's elections. And Ilham gets away with signing, without actually signing a peace treaty, while getting a road through Syunik, without actually giving up anything in return as far as transportation systems that are useful to our side, while at the same time getting the legitimacy of having this meeting in the White House. From the information that we have, Ilham Aliyev was actually under intense pressure from the Americans to actually move ahead with this and actually show up in DC and initial whatever they're going to do with this agreement tomorrow. And then he was actually given a deadline of August 1st. And what is this really about? This is about the United States officially and formally taking over the peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan, taking ownership of it, and in so many words, pushing the Russians out of this and obviously out of the road and transportation systems. In actual hard political terms, this is actually what this is about. It's about the U.S. taking over something very significant in the Russian sphere of influence. Now, what I want to move to is to sort of explain what is actually in this quote-unquote peace agreement. Whether it's going to be signed or not is not irrelevant. People really don't know the specifics, and there's been much information and misinformation that's been put out there. It actually has 17 points, most of whom are really not that controversial. There is one point, however, which is catastrophic. The Armenian commitment side to withdraw from legal mechanisms against the Aliyev regime. These are the court cases that we have in regards to the crimes that were committed both in Artsakh and in Armenia between 20 and 22. What does this mean in actual practical terms? What this means is that we will officially put our stamp of approval on the second Armenian genocide in Artsakh between 20 and 23. It also means withdrawing from cases that have been filed because of specific crimes that were committed against Armenian service members actually inside of Armenia's state borders in 22, including the execution, rape, murder, mutilation, and other war crimes committed against Armenian service members on Armenian soil. This is in fact beyond disgraceful. No country or people that has any honor or pride would ever agree to this, and obviously we have no pride and we all have no honor, so we have agreed to it. However, what is as problematic in this agreement is not actually what's in it, is actually what is not in it. First and foremost, there's no freedom for the hostages. There's no commitment to withdraw from occupied Armenian territories. That's supposed to happen in a demarcation of the borders, which will never happen in areas that they're occupying, only in areas that are not controversial. Obviously, no right of return of people to go back to their home in Artsakh, even though this is frankly an international right and this treaty cannot affect that one way or the other. There's also nothing about protecting our cultural assets in Artsakh that have been left behind. This is, by the way, in the hands of a regime that has actually destroyed more cultural sites than ISIS ever did. In short, this is a disastrous agreement contrary to our long-term national interests, and the biggest favor Ilham Aliyev has ever done to this country is in his refusal to sign it. This obviously leads to a question, why would Ilham Aliyev pass on such a fantastic victory for his country in signing this agreement? There's actually multiple reasons for it. It's actually quite rational. The first one is what's good for him is not necessarily good for his country. Secondly is his people might not need an Armenian enemy, but he does. No Armenian enemy, and every issue that they have in that country becomes domestic, i.e. a failing economy, having no political freedoms and everything that goes with that. Fourth, having won everything that he has in Artsakh without ever signing anything and without being punished for the crimes that he's committed or being ostracized for the genocide that he committed or becoming a non-person as he should have become. What reason does he have to sign anything, considering that this is pretty much the only thing he's been successful with, and it's the thing that keeps on giving, and it's also necessary for his long-term political outlook and his long-term political survival. Fifth, while our side is seeking peace, what he is striving for is complete victory, which, if we're being honest, is actually the right approach. At this point, what does complete victory mean for him? It is piling on humiliation after humiliation on this country, like forcing us to change our constitution and half a dozen other things. The sixth point is that time is not on his side. A few years from now, the window for aggression is going to close. It's really not even going to be on the table. His hyperactivity and hyperaggression at this point is not based on strength, it's actually based on a fear of future weakness. His country has no future, especially when it comes to the economy, and he understands that. Frankly, he understands it in ways that our leaders do not. And lastly, most importantly, signing any kind of a peace agreement, a final one, will burn the last of his bridges to Russia, which, despite all of the rhetoric right now about somehow they're having a break or they're having a political fallout, is actually not true. What we do know is most likely during the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh in late 23, there was a deal made with Mr. Putin in which he would actually greenlight the ethnic cleansing and the Russian withdrawal if that meant continued Azeri aggression against Armenia and the delivery of this road through Syunik to the Russian FSB, which was originally what was written in the November 9th agreement. I want to speak a little bit about the very specific Trump-Ilham dynamic. I generally avoid psychoanalyzing political leaders because it's generally a road to bad analysis, but in this case, it's somewhat unavoidable. It's very clear that Ilham Aliyev fears Donald Trump because he thinks of him as crazy and unpredictable. Donald Trump taking over personal ownership of this peace process, or whatever we call it, is actually very good because he will take anybody who starts a war as a personal affront to him. Ilham, while being very politically smart, tactically as smart, and with someone who has actually impeccable timing instincts, also has a very sociopathic side to his personality. And what sociopathic personalities are generally insecure and they fear losing control and they fear social rejection, which brings us to this moment. Trump's approach is actually quite problematic in other matters around the world, but his personality is actually quite useful for our purposes. Now let us move on and discuss this Trump road. You know, the path that brought us here is actually not a good one, but let's talk about the specifics. I actually support U.S. presence in that road if it actually needs to be done, because U.S. prestige politically and economically means that essentially rules out any aggression against Armenia in the short term, which is actually a huge political win. There's much to despise about U.S. foreign policy, but if we're actually honest about it, if you look around the world, you see what the U.S. footprint brings historically compared to what the Russian footprint brings. The former one leads to Israel, South Korea, and Poland, and the Russian one leads to Tajikistan, Syria, and Belarus. Now let us discuss what actually brought us to this moment that we're actually spending our time talking about the road rather than other things. And this is actually a result of specific policy failures of this government, and let me explain them to you. One of the things in background, if you ever talk to government officials in Armenia, is they'll always tell you how few cards we have to play, and that the other side has much better cards to deal with, which is actually true. But in politics, you actually make your own cards, and if the cards aren't favorable to you, you try to set up get a new deck of hands to have better outcomes. Let me give you a perfect example of that. If for the past 2 years we had been talking about the criminality of the regime in Baku, in Artsakh, whether it is talking about filing with the ICC or even discussing filing with the International Criminal Court, because this is something, it's a slam dunk case as far as moving this forward. Or better yet, shaming the world for its inaction, holding a donor conference and all of these things. If the topic of discussion was about the criminality of the regime in Artsakh, we would not be talking about the road today. If, for example, we had filed with the ICC in October of 23 for the crimes committed in Artsakh and in Armenia prior to that, today we would not be discussing the road, we'd be discussing which countries Ilham Aliyev could no longer fly into. So instead of that, we're actually discussing a road through Syunik, no matter who it controls, without getting anything in returns. You have to ask yourself, what is the logic behind this? Why is this government moving in the way that it did? And I think it's a few reasons. This government and this prime minister have trapped themselves in this peace language on a peace agenda, which they frankly cannot deliver. And they continually go down and doubling down and making commitments on something that's going to lead to no good ending. Second of all is fear. In short, this government fears anything that will lead to war, and that's understandable. However, at the end of the day, you cannot make policy or foreign policy based on fear. And in truth, if you're that fearful, maybe you should not be making foreign policy. As a final point, what's interesting is in the reluctance of this government to even use Artsakh to defend Armenia today, is that their approach is almost ideological. And this is quite interesting because, frankly, they, like most other people in Armenian politics, they have really no set ideology. But when it comes to this particular issue, which is bearing the Artsakh issue and Artsakhi's themselves, their approach is ideological to the extent that the Stalinists were ideological in their approach in implementing collectivization. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Insights.
He's taller than me, he's like 6'2", which is why I don't understand why his hands are the size of someone who's 5'2". Have you seen his hands?
Look at those hands.
And you know what they say about men with small hands?
I guarantee you there's no problem. I guarantee. Okay. Moving on.